Hey there, I'm Brittany Smith, and you're watching Filmmaker Symposium. So today we're going to dive right into a discussion about a book called Story by Robert Mckee. It's about the art and technique of storytelling. It kind of dives into the details and into the nitty-gritty of how to create a really good story. And since the Christian film industry is really suffering in this area, I felt like this would be a good place to start, because story undergirds everything in a movie. It undergirds the music, it undergirds the visuals, everything. So story is a great place to start. If you don't have this book, I highly recommend that you purchase it. I've included the link below, so if you want to go ahead and click on it and see if you want to purchase it, I highly recommend it. You'll have it on your shelf and you'll use it as a resource. And there's a lot of things that we won't be able to cover in the YouTube videos that we're doing, so you want to make sure that you get everything out of this book. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start with chapter 1. Normally I would start with the introduction, but most of the introduction will be covered in later chapters in the book, so I'm just going to start with chapter 1 and we'll go from there. So the first chapter is called The Story Problem, and our first heading is The Decline of Story. So he starts out with the importance of story in the life of humanity and how story is just kind of woven into the human experience. So when we go to the grocery store and we're telling a story about the parking lot, a certain incident, we're telling a story. And if we're gossiping about a friend with someone else, hopefully not, but if we are, we're telling a story. And even when I teach piano, there's certain things that I'll use as stories for the kids so that they'll remember the concepts I'm teaching. We even dream in stories. So story is a huge part of the human experience. And I think the reason why it's part of the human experience is because we're reflecting God's image, and God is the master storyteller. He has created the world from the beginning, and here came the fall, and then we have redemption, and then the glorification. So he's created this story that is just this grand, amazing, harmonious story that's going to come together in the end. And so I think it's built in our genetics and in our soul that we're a part of story, and we are to communicate in story, and we respond to story because we're living story. So Robert Mckee goes on to explain that many people, whether subconsciously or consciously, they are always asking the question of, how should I live my life? We don't hear people saying that all the time, but usually it's a subconscious thing. And he says that story is a way that we cope with reality. And I thought it was an interesting concept, because when you really think about how Christ, when he came to earth, he was preaching sermons, but he was also teaching parables. And parables are stories. So if the God of the universe is using story to teach people, that should really kind of catch our attention. And I think one great thing about parables and stories is that it engages everything about us. It engages our mind, it engages our heart, it engages our desires and our ethics and our morals and everything. So story is something that just kind of digs down into the deep truths of the universe and causes us to really grapple with those concepts. So what's great for us is that we have a lot of technology that has developed. Robert Mckee talks about how we have so much available to us with technology, and it's easier to make a movie. But for some reason, storytelling has actually declined over the years, which is interesting. It's kind of ironic that you'd have more availability to make stories through film, but yet storytelling is just tanking, especially in the last 25 years. And he says that when storytelling starts declining, you're going to start seeing more lewdness and violence and razzle-dazzle demo reels, as he calls them. But basically storytellers run out of things to do because they don't know how to tell a story, so they start inserting all these fillers. And we're seeing that, especially I think in the last 5 years. You just go on Amazon Prime or Netflix, and you'll get hooked onto some sort of show and then realize, oh my goodness, it's just riddled with sex scenes, or the violence is just so intense and so overdone. Well, that's because they have no story to work with, or if they do have a story, it's not a very good one. So they're trying to insert all these fillers that will draw audiences, because audiences, unfortunately, are attracted to sex and violence. Now, having said that, it does boil down to money, which he also talks about, that the film industry is now entirely about money and not about storytelling. So the next section is called Loss of Craft. Now, he starts out with the idea that there are thousands upon thousands of screenplays that are written every single year, and many of them are just absolutely horrible with storytelling. He does say that there are some talented writers out there who don't master their craft. And it's kind of like someone who is born musical, but they don't learn an instrument. So even though they might be musical, if they don't know the principles of playing an instrument or the theory behind it, they're going to be terrible musicians. So there are some people who are born with talent, but they just don't have the means of refining their craft. And he actually turns to the universities and starts talking about universities and colleges and what they're producing with the education aspect of things. And he seems to think that storytelling in universities is not being taught, that it's just not really there. Or if it is there, it's being taught wrong. And in the past, that used to be true. It used to be true that storytelling was being taught from colleges and universities, but now it's not. And you have all these people graduating from colleges and universities and going into Hollywood with really poor storytelling technique. So he really highlights the fact that apprenticeships used to be a thing, but now you can't even be an apprentice to anyone because we don't have any masters anymore. So we're in a really huge rut with storytelling in our culture right now. We really need people to learn this craft on their own, because obviously the colleges and universities are not teaching people, and we need to have people independently coming up and telling good stories and start teaching others how to create those stories as well. So he also talks about how amateurs tend to learn from experience, which is a pity because experience is basically just watching movies. So you can't really just watch a bunch of movies and think, oh, I can write a story. That's not how it works. It's the same with a symphony. You can't go to the symphony and go, oh, I like that symphony. I'm going to go and see if I can write one down myself. It just doesn't work that way. But the difference between an amateur and a professional is that a professional knows the knowledge that goes into the craft. The professional knows the theory, the technique, and all the ins and outs of what's going on with a story. So he really highlights that difference between amateurs and professionals. Now, here's what's really interesting. Robert Mckee does go into what he thinks is the cause of this lack of good storytelling. And he seems to think it's from the lack of values in our society. That when you have a lack of values, people don't know what to value anymore. And people, when they go to write a story, they don't know how to write a story that values anything. So I thought it was an interesting observation on his part. I don't think he's a Christian, but definitely an interesting observation. So the next section is the story imperative. And he starts out with these two different examples of him writing a review on two different screenplays. The first screenplay has really good writing in the sense that they're good writers. But the second screenplay is more of a good story and poor writing. And he goes on to say that the story is primary. So you can have good writing and all that stuff, but if you don't have good story, then it's a bad screenplay altogether. So story is primary. Story is a thing that will make people leave a theater and go, wow, that was a great story. And it will actually carry on with them either for the rest of their lives, or it'll be something they'll be chewing on for a really long time. Good stories have a way of really nagging at our hearts and our minds and just kind of challenging us at deeper levels that we don't even realize. So the next section is story and life, and he goes into two different failed story structures. The first one is the personal story structure, where someone is writing more about the day-to-day things and the day-to-day problems, and this person tends to deal with what he calls the small t, which is small truth. compared to big truth. And so big truth are the big universal truths that we all grapple with and try to deal with on a deeper level. And the small truths are the things that we deal with day to day and are kind of more surface. And then, so the second one would be the commercial storyteller. This would be like the shoot 'em up, big visuals and major effects and, action and stuff like that. So this really appeals to entertainment. So when you leave the theater, you're like, wow, that was really cool. But 30 years down the road, you don't really remember that movie because it really wasn't a good story. It was just a bunch of cool visuals. And he mentions that we can have cool visuals, but they need to kind of vanish behind the story. The story should be at the forefront, and the visuals and effects, they just support the story. And something that comes to mind would be the movie Inception. It's a very interesting story. Christopher Nolan is an amazing storyteller. And there's that scene where that guy is kind of floating around in the hallway, and no, not floating. I think he's fighting someone in the hallway. You can tell it really stuck with me, right? So he's fighting someone in the hallway, and we don't realize as the viewer that behind the scenes, they've got this huge rotating room that these actors are acting in. And because in order to pull off the feat that they did, they had to defy gravity, and you can't defy gravity, so they had to create a rotating room. So anyway, that's an example of the story being at the forefront, and the effect is just kind of vanishing behind the story. So what we're focusing on is, oh wow, they're fighting in the hallway, and it's hard because they don't have gravity, but we don't realize that, oh, this is a really cool effect. So anyway, but that's just one thing that comes to mind with the commercial side of things. So last but not least, we've got powers and talents. So powers is kind of a weird way of putting it, but he kind of reflects back on the previous section with the personal and commercial writers. And he talks about how even though they don't know how to write good story, they have some great powers to utilize for story. So the personal writer is really good at activating the senses of a reader. So that's a great thing to have on your belt. And then a commercial writer is really good at transporting someone to an unimaginable world. So, but in order to be a good storyteller, you need to be able to do both. You can't just, lean on one or the other. You need to start working on both. And then he goes into the two talents that he thinks are necessary for having story talent. The first one is having literary talent, which is just knowing how to write and knowing to write descriptions and details and dialogue and all that. But most importantly, of course, the second talent is just having story talent. And story talent is when you can convert life experiences into more powerful and deeper more powerful experiences and with more deeper meaning. So it's basically taking life and making it into something that is more understandable and more deep. And I like the last quote that he gives us. He gives us, the material for story talent is life itself. And I love that because I have found that when I write about things that I'm not familiar with, specifically certain emotions or certain life experiences, I don't relate to it and my readers don't like it. But when I'm relating to things that I am more in touch with, emotions or experiences, my readers tend to like it a lot more. So definitely write about life. Don't write about something you are unfamiliar with, because story is about life. So you want to make sure that your style is coming through with your life. So. Well, that's all that I have for today, but I hope you enjoyed this episode of going over Chapter 1 of Story by Robert Mckee. and I hope you'll join us for chapter 2. So please let me know if there's anything about this video that you'd like to discuss. Particularly, I would love to discuss it in the comments. I'd love for other people to benefit from the conversation. So don't be afraid. It's not scary. I'm just Brittany. I don't bite too hard. But go ahead and write in the comments, start discussion, or if you really need to email me, that's fine too. I also have a Facebook page. I'll be releasing a Facebook group page too, so it might be easier to discuss things that way. So I'll keep everyone posted on that as that gets developed. All right, well, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.